There is a war that killed more people than the First World War. A war that swallowed cities whole, that toppled a dynasty, that reshaped the largest country on earth. A war led by a man who believed, genuinely, completely, without a shadow of doubt, that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. And there is a very good chance that until recently, you had never heard of it. Good evening, and welcome. Tonight we are going somewhere most history books in the West have quietly skipped over. We are going to 19th century China, to a world of rice paddies and river deltas, of imperial palaces and starving villages, of ancient dynasties and impossible dreams. We are going to the story of the Taiping Rebellion, and I promise you, by the time this story is finished, you will never quite understand why it was kept from you. But before we begin, if you are enjoying what we do here, take just a moment to like this video and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means everything for keeping these stories alive and finding their way to people who need them. And before we drift into the past tonight, drop your location and your local time in the comments below. Whether you are listening at midnight in California, or just past 10 in Toronto, or somewhere in between where the world has already gone quiet around you, there is something genuinely comforting about knowing that people across every time zone are settling in at the same moment, pulling the blankets a little higher, and listening to the same story together. So get comfortable. Let your body sink into wherever you are resting tonight. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. Because tonight's journey begins not with a battle, not with a vision, not with a man standing on a mountain declaring himself divine. It begins much more quietly than that. It begins with a dynasty that had forgotten how to hold itself together, and it begins in a place that the rest of the world was only just beginning to pay attention to. China, in the early 19th century, was the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. It had been building cities when Europe was still sleeping in mud huts. It had invented paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass. Its philosophers had mapped the human condition centuries before Socrates drew his first breath. And at the centre of all of it, holding the whole vast enterprise together, sat the Qing dynasty. The emperors of the Qing had ruled China since 1644, when the Manchu people swept down from the north and toppled the Ming dynasty that had governed China for nearly 3 centuries before them. The Manchu were not Han Chinese. They were outsiders, northerners, a people with their own language, their own customs, their own way of seeing the world. And from the very first day they took the throne in Beijing, a quiet tension ran beneath the surface of Chinese society like a crack in old porcelain. Not always visible, not always dangerous, but always there. For a long time, the Qing managed it brilliantly. The early Qing emperors were among the most capable rulers China had ever produced. The Kangxi Emperor, who reigned for 61 years from 1661 to 1722, expanded China's territory to its greatest extent in history, governed with a combination of military brilliance and genuine intellectual curiosity, and held together an empire of staggering diversity with what can only be described as masterful political instinct. His grandson, the Qianlong Emperor, continued this expansion and presided over what historians sometimes call the High Qing, a period of enormous wealth, territorial power, and cultural achievement that lasted through most of the 18th century. China during this era was not a struggling nation. It was the wealthiest, most populous, most powerful state on earth. Its GDP accounted for somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of total global economic output. Its cities were larger than anything in Europe. Its bureaucracy, built on centuries of Confucian tradition and the rigorous examination system that selected scholars for government posts, was the most sophisticated administrative apparatus anywhere in the world. But underneath all of that wealth and power and ancient tradition, something was beginning to go wrong. And it was going wrong in the way that catastrophes most often do. Not all at once, not with a single dramatic rupture, but slowly, quietly, in 100 small ways that each seemed manageable on their own, until one day they all arrived together and nothing was manageable anymore. The first problem was population. China's population had been growing steadily for over a century, fed by the introduction of new crops from the Americas, sweet potatoes, maize, peanuts, that could grow in soil too poor for traditional rice farming. These crops had been a miracle. They had fed millions of people who would otherwise have starved. But miracles have a way of creating new problems. As the population grew, the pressure on agricultural land grew with it. Farms were divided and subdivided between sons until individual plots were barely large enough to sustain a single family. The margins of survival narrowed. A bad harvest was no longer a hardship. It was a catastrophe. And in the mountains and river valleys of southern China, where the soil was thin and the rains were unpredictable, catastrophes were becoming more and more common. The second problem was structural. The Qing government, for all its historical sophistication, was running on machinery that had been designed for a smaller, simpler China. The bureaucracy had not grown to keep pace with the population. The number of government officials responsible for administering local affairs had barely changed in 2 centuries, even as the number of people those officials were supposed to serve had doubled, then tripled. The result was a system stretched so thin it was almost transparent. Corruption flourished in the gaps. Local officials, underpaid and overwhelmed, supplemented their incomes through bribes and extortion. The taxes that were supposed to flow upward to the imperial centre were skimmed at every level, so that by the time they arrived in Beijing there was never quite enough to maintain the roads, the canals, the flood control systems that kept the agricultural heartland alive. Infrastructure decayed. Floods came more often and hit harder, and the people who suffered most were always the same people: the farmers, the labourers, the landless poor, scratching a living from the margins of a society that had stopped paying attention to them. The third problem came from outside, and it arrived on ships. European powers, led by Britain, had been circling China's coastline for decades, eager to crack open what they understood to be the most lucrative consumer market on earth. The problem was that China did not particularly want what Europe was selling. The Chinese had everything they needed. Their silk, their porcelain, their tea were in enormous demand across the Western world. But when British merchants arrived with wool, cotton, manufactured goods, the response from Chinese consumers was polite indifference. The trade balance was almost entirely in China's favour. Silver flowed into China from Europe, and barely anything flowed back. This was a problem for the British East India Company, which needed to find something, anything, that Chinese consumers would actually buy. They found it in opium. Poppy cultivation in British-controlled India produced opium in vast quantities, and when British merchants began quietly introducing it into southern China through unofficial channels, through smugglers and corrupt port officials and the dense network of underground commerce that operated in the shadows of the official economy, they discovered that the Chinese market for it was almost unlimited. Opium was not new to China. It had been used medicinally for centuries. But the heavily processed form now arriving from India was something different. It was far more potent, far more addictive, and far cheaper than anything previously available. It spread through Chinese society with terrifying speed. By the 1830s, the number of opium addicts in China numbered in the millions. Silver that had flowed into China for generations began flowing back out, draining the currency supply and destabilizing the economy. The social cost was incalculable. Farmers who spent their last coins on opium, officials who could not perform their duties, soldiers who could not fight, families hollowed out from the inside by a substance that the Qing government had officially banned but proved completely unable to stop. When the Chinese government finally tried to enforce that ban in 1839, seizing and destroying over 1,000 tons of British-owned opium in the port of Canton. Britain responded with military force. What followed was the First Opium War, a conflict that lasted from 1839 to 1842 and ended in one of the most consequential defeats in Chinese history. British gunboats, armed with modern cannon and steam power, dismantled Chinese coastal defences with almost contemptuous ease. The Chinese military, equipped with weapons and tactics that had barely evolved in 2 centuries, was simply outmatched. The Treaty of Nanking that ended the war forced China to open 5 ports to foreign trade, cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain, pay an enormous indemnity, and grant British citizens special legal privileges on Chinese soil that placed them effectively beyond the reach of Chinese law. It was a humiliation of the most public and devastating kind, and it announced to everyone paying attention, inside China and outside it, that the Qing dynasty, for all its ancient authority, for all its ceremonial grandeur, could not protect its own territory from foreign ships. In the capital, the court tried to absorb the shock and move on. But in the provinces, particularly in the south, the reverberations were enormous. The ports opened by the treaty flooded the local market with cheap foreign goods. Silk weavers and cotton spinners who had sustained their families for generations found their livelihoods undercut overnight. Boatmen who had worked the inland waterways found their trade rerouted toward the new foreign-controlled ports. Unemployment rose. Wages fell. The economic disruption layered itself on top of the agricultural pressures and the opium crisis and the decaying infrastructure and the corrupt local government, and the result was a southern China simmering in a kind of low-grade desperation that had no obvious outlet and no obvious end. It is important to sit with this for a moment, because what we are describing is not simply poverty. Poverty, in the abstract, does not produce rebellion. What produces rebellion is a specific kind of poverty, the kind that arrives after something better, the kind that feels like a betrayal, the kind that is accompanied by a visible and identifiable cause. The farmers of southern China in the 1840s were not simply poor. They were poor in a way that felt new, that felt wrong, that felt like something had been taken from them. The Qing government, already resented as foreign Manchu rulers, had failed to protect them from the foreigners outside and the corrupt officials inside. The old order, which had at least provided a kind of stability if not prosperity, was visibly crumbling, and into that crumbling world, a new idea was about to arrive. Not a political idea, not a military strategy, but something far stranger, and in some ways far more powerful. A religious vision. A divine mandate. A man who had looked into the abyss of his own failure and come back, convinced that God had spoken to him personally and given him a mission that would shake the world. But before we get to that man, we need to understand the specific corner of China where he was born, because place matters enormously in this story. The Taiping Rebellion did not emerge from Beijing, the seat of imperial power, or from Shanghai, the great trading city of the coast. It emerged from Guangdong province, and particularly from the mountainous hinterlands of Guangxi in the deep south of China. This was a region that sat at the edge of everything, at the edge of the empire's attention, at the edge of its prosperity, at the edge of its administrative reach. The Pearl River Delta, which drained this part of China into the South China Sea, was one of the most densely populated and economically active regions in the country. Canton, the great southern port, had been for centuries the primary point of contact between China and the outside world. It was here that European merchants had first established their trading houses. It was here that the earliest trickles of foreign influence had entered the country. But the prosperity of the Delta did not extend evenly into the surrounding hills. The mountainous regions of Guangxi province, where rocky terrain made farming difficult and infrastructure almost non-existent, were home to a population that lived at the sharpest edge of economic survival. And among that population were communities that faced an additional layer of difficulty. The Hakka people, whose name literally means guest families, were a Han Chinese subgroup whose ancestors had migrated south from central China over several centuries, pushed by war and famine and displacement. They spoke their own dialect, maintained their own customs, and had settled in the hilly areas that more established local populations had not claimed. Relations between the Hakka and the local Cantonese-speaking population, known as the Punti, were frequently tense and sometimes violent. Competition over farmland, over water rights, over market access generated a slow-burning communal hostility that occasionally erupted into open conflict. The Hakka were hard-working, clannish, fiercely proud, and acutely aware that they occupied a marginal position in the social landscape of the region. They were not quite outsiders. They had been in Guangdong and Guangxi for generations, but they were not quite insiders either. They lived in a permanent condition of having to prove themselves in a world that had not entirely made room for them. It was into a Hakka family in a village in Guangdong province that Hong Xiuquan was born in 1814. He was born into modest circumstances but not absolute poverty. His family were farmers of the respectable lower sort, not wealthy, not destitute, working the land and hoping for enough rain and enough peace to get through each year. Hong showed intellectual promise from an early age, and his family, recognizing it, made the sacrifices necessary to educate him. In Imperial China, education had one primary purpose for a boy of Hong's background. It was the pathway to the civil service examinations. The examination system was the great meritocratic engine of Chinese civilization. In theory, any man regardless of birth could sit the exams, and if he passed, the doors of government service and social advancement would open before him. It was a system that had functioned, with various interruptions and reforms, for over 1,000 years, and it was the single most powerful aspiration in the lives of educated young men across the empire. Hong Xiuquan studied. He studied deeply and seriously, with the focused intensity of someone who understood that everything depended on it. He travelled to Canton to sit the preliminary examinations, and he failed. This was not unusual. The examinations were extraordinarily difficult, and failure rates were high. He tried again. He failed again. In 1836, he travelled to Canton for a third attempt. He was 22 years old. He had spent years of his life and his family's limited resources in preparation. He walked past a Protestant missionary near the examination hall who was distributing Christian pamphlets, short texts offering an introduction to the basic tenets of the new foreign religion that had begun to trickle into southern China through the ports. Hong took one. He glanced through it. He did not read it carefully. He put it away. He went into the examination hall. And he failed again. The failure this time was different. 3 failures meant that the examination path was effectively closed. The social meaning of this in the context of 19th century Chinese society is difficult to overstate. Hong had been identified as the promising one. His family had invested in him. His community had expectations of him. The examination system was not just an academic exercise. It was the primary mechanism through which a man of his background could demonstrate his worth, achieve respectability, secure his family's future. To fail it repeatedly was not just a personal disappointment. It was a public verdict on his value as a human being. And Hong Xiuquan, travelling home to his village in the spring of 1837, carrying that verdict inside him, collapsed. What happened next would change the history of China. Hong fell into a prolonged fever. He was bedridden for weeks, sliding in and out of consciousness. His family gathered around him, unsure whether he would survive. And during those weeks of fever and delirium, he had visions. Vivid, overwhelming, terrifyingly real visions. He saw himself transported to a heavenly realm of golden light. He saw an old man with a golden beard seated on a throne, who gave him a sword and commanded him to go forth and slay the demons that were corrupting the world. He saw a middle-aged man who acted as a brother and a teacher, guiding him through the celestial landscape and showing him the shape of his mission. He fought demons in his visions. He received divine instruction. He was transformed. When Hong finally recovered and returned to the world of the living, his family noticed that he seemed changed. He carried himself differently. He spoke with a new kind of authority, but he offered no immediate explanation for what he had experienced. He did not yet have a framework for understanding it. He simply went on with his life, or tried to. He took up work as a village schoolteacher. He prepared, without much conviction, for a fourth attempt at the examinations. He returned to Canton and failed that attempt too in 1843, the fourth and final time the system would close its doors in his face. And it was after this last failure, sitting once again with the weight of rejection pressing down on him, that Hong Xiuquan finally picked up that pamphlet he had received 7 years earlier outside the examination hall. He read it. This time, he read it carefully. And as he read, something extraordinary happened inside him. The pamphlet described God the Father and Jesus Christ the Son. It described heaven as a realm of golden light. It described a divine mission to save humanity from evil. And as Hong read these words, the visions he had experienced during his illness 7 years before suddenly clicked into focus with the force of revelation. The old man on the golden throne, that was God the Father, Shangdi, the Lord of Heaven. The middle-aged man who had guided him and called him brother, that was Jesus Christ. Which meant that Hong Xiuquan, failed examination candidate, village schoolteacher, son of a Hakka farming family in the mountains of Guangdong, was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, the second Son of God, sent to earth on a divine mission to cleanse China of its demons and establish a heavenly kingdom. It sounds, from the distance of nearly 2 centuries, like the delusion of a man broken by failure and fever. And perhaps that is part of what it was. But it was also something more than that. Because Hong Xiuquan did not keep this revelation to himself, he began to teach it, and the world he was teaching it in was a world that was hungry, desperately, dangerously hungry, for exactly this kind of message. The message Hong preached was not simply a new religion. It was a complete reordering of the world. He drew on the Christian pamphlet and later on a fuller translation of the Bible obtained through an American missionary named Issachar Roberts, whom he briefly studied with in Canton. But he filtered everything through his own visions, his own interpretation, his own cultural context. The Christianity that emerged was something the missionaries who had brought those pamphlets to China would barely have recognized. It kept the monotheism, the moral framework, the heaven and hell, but it added Hong himself as a divine figure. It incorporated elements of Chinese tradition and folk belief, and it spoke directly to the specific grievances and dreams of the people Hong was trying to reach. And chief among those grievances was the Qing dynasty itself. Because in Hong's theology, the Manchu rulers of China were not simply corrupt or incompetent. They were demons, literally, the alien Manchu, who had conquered China from the north 2 centuries earlier and imposed their foreign rule on the Han majority, were in Hong's cosmology instruments of evil, standing between the Chinese people and the divine order that God intended for them. To overthrow the Qing was not merely a political act. It was a sacred duty. It was the mission God had sent Hong to earth to accomplish. And for a population that already resented Manchu rule, that struggled under the weight of an imperial system that had failed them, that had watched their world come apart under the pressure of economic collapse and foreign humiliation. This was not an abstract theological argument. It was a permission slip. It was a divine mandate to do what many of them had been quietly longing to do for years. Hong began baptizing converts. He travelled through the hills of Guangdong and Guangxi with a small group of disciples, preaching his gospel to the farmers and labourers, and unemployed men who gathered to listen. He found his earliest and most important allies not among the educated class, but among exactly the kind of people the Qing system had left behind: charcoal burners, miners, landless labourers. Men who had nothing to lose, and who had been told, for the first time in their lives, that God was on their side. He found them in the mountains of Guangxi, where the thin soil and the communal tensions between Hakka and Punti had created a population already primed for confrontation. He preached there, and he baptized there, and he organized there, and the movement he was building was unlike anything China had seen before. It was called the God-worshipping Society. And by the late 1840s, it had tens of thousands of members. It had its own rituals, its own prayers, its own internal hierarchy. It enforced a strict moral code: no opium, no alcohol, no gambling, no prostitution, no worship of traditional Chinese gods or ancestors. It separated men and women in worship, which scandalized traditional Chinese sensibilities, but also gave women a formal role in religious life that the Confucian order had never provided. It promised its members not just salvation in the next world, but justice in this one: a reordering of society in which the poor would be lifted up, and the corrupt, and the foreign, and the demonic would be cast down. And increasingly, it was training its members not just to pray, but to fight. Because Hong and his inner circle understood, even as the movement was still gathering itself in the mountains, that what was coming would not be accomplished by prayer alone. The God-worshipping society was becoming an army. It was learning to drill, to organize, to move together. It was accumulating weapons, not the sophisticated firearms of the European powers, but swords and spears and whatever else could be obtained or improvised in the rural highlands of Guangxi. And it was drawing in people whose skills were precisely what an army needed. Miners who knew how to work with explosives, former soldiers who had served in the deteriorating Qing military and found their way out again, men whose physical strength and organizational ability made them natural leaders in a world that was already beginning to slide toward open conflict. The Qing government was aware that something was stirring in Guangxi. The province had always been difficult to govern, remote, mountainous, ethnically mixed, chronically underfunded. Local officials sent reports to the provincial capital warning of the God-worshippers and their disturbing combination of heretical religion and military organization. But the Qing response was slow, disorganized, and ultimately inadequate. The dynasty was still absorbing the trauma of the Opium War. Its military resources were stretched. Its political attention was pulled in too many directions at once. And the men on the ground in Guangxi, who might have suppressed Hong's movement in its early stages, lacked the resources, the will, or the competence to do so effectively. By 1850, the tension between the God-worshipping society and local Qing forces had escalated into open skirmishing. Hong and his followers began consolidating, calling in members from across the region to gather in the mountain town of Jintian in northern Guangxi. Families arrived with whatever they owned, having sold or abandoned their farms and homes. They came because they believed they were answering a divine call. They came because they had nothing left to lose. They came because the world they had known was already gone, and the only thing moving forward was this. By the time the Qing forces moved to confront them, the God-worshipping society had become something too large and too organized and too committed to be simply scattered. On January 11th, 1851, Hong Xiuquan's 37th birthday, he made the announcement that formalized what everyone already knew. He declared the establishment of the Taiping Tianguo, the heavenly kingdom of great peace. He proclaimed himself the heavenly king, and he called on his followers to march. The Taiping Rebellion had begun, and the world, though it did not yet know it, was about to witness one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. But the story of how that conflict began and the story of the man at its centre is rooted in everything we have traced tonight, in the slow decay of a dynasty that had outlived its vitality, in the economic devastation wrought by opium and foreign pressure and administrative collapse, in the communal tensions of a marginalised people searching for dignity, in the psychology of a brilliant, sensitive man who could not survive the verdict that the system passed on him, and in the strange, combustible meeting between ancient Chinese resentment and a fragment of a foreign religion, filtered through a fevered vision and transformed into something entirely new. We have set the stage. The powder keg has been loaded over decades of pressure and pain, and in the mountains of Guangxi, someone has finally struck the match. There is something that happens to a man when the world tells him, repeatedly and officially, that he is not enough, when the gates that were supposed to open for him stay closed, when the path that everyone around him believed he was destined to walk simply ends in a wall. Most men, when this happens, find a way to absorb the blow and continue. They redirect, they diminish their expectations, they fold the disappointment quietly into themselves and get on with the smaller life that remains. But occasionally, rarely, in the way that historical earthquakes are rare, a man does something else entirely. He refuses the verdict. He constructs an alternative reality in which the failure was not a failure at all, but a preparation, in which the closed gates were not rejections, but redirections towards something infinitely larger, in which he was not passed over by the world, but chosen by heaven itself. Hong Xiuquan was that kind of man. And to understand what he built, what he unleashed, what he became, you have to understand first what was broken inside him, and what grew in the place of what was broken. He was born in 1814 in the village of Fuyuanshui, in Guangdong province, the fourth child of a Hakka farming family. From the beginning he was identified as the clever one, the one worth investing in. His father and his older brothers worked the land while Hong studied, and this arrangement carried with it an enormous weight of collective expectation. In the Hakka community, as in Han Chinese society more broadly, the civil service examinations were not merely an academic exercise. They were the ladder. The one legitimate mechanism by which a boy from a farming family could climb out of the mud and into something resembling security and respect. To pass the examinations was to transform not just your own life, but your family's standing, your village's pride, your lineage's future. And to fail them was to bring all of that crashing down. Hong first travelled to Canton to sit the preliminary county examinations as a teenager. He passed that initial hurdle, which was enough to earn him the title of licentiate and mark him as a serious candidate for higher examination. But the higher examinations, the provincial level exams that would open the door to actual government appointment, were a different matter entirely. The questions were exhaustive. The competition was ferocious. Tens of thousands of candidates competed for a handful of places. And Hong, despite his evident intelligence and his years of preparation, could not break through. He tried in 1828. He tried again in 1836. Each failure was its own small catastrophe, not just personally, but financially, because travelling to Canton and sitting the examinations cost money that his family could barely afford. But it was the 1836 trip that would prove, in the most unexpected way, to be the pivot point of his entire life and of Chinese history, because it was on that trip, passing through the crowded streets of Canton near the examination hall, that Hong encountered a Protestant missionary distributing religious literature. The missionary was almost certainly associated with the early Protestant evangelizing efforts that had begun to penetrate southern China through the open port of Canton. The literature he handed Hong was a collection of texts called Good Words to Admonish the Age, compiled by a Chinese Christian convert named Liang Affa. It was a mixture of translated biblical passages, moral exhortation, and evangelical argument, a document designed to introduce the basic concepts of Protestant Christianity to a Chinese readership. Hong took the pamphlet. He did not read it. Not then. He was focused on the examination. He tucked it away and walked into the hall and sat the test that he had spent years preparing for. And he failed again. He carried the failure home to his village. And somewhere in the process of that journey, or perhaps in the weeks that followed it, he fell ill. The illness that took Hong Xiuquan in the spring of 1837 was severe enough that his family feared for his life. He was bedridden for an extended period. Accounts suggest somewhere between 30 and 40 days, cycling through fever and delirium in a way that alarmed everyone around him. He shouted, he wept. He appeared to be fighting something invisible. At times, he seemed almost calm, as if listening to voices that no one else could hear. At other times, he was agitated beyond consolation. His family kept watch. They prayed in the traditional way, burned incense, sought the help of local healers, and eventually, slowly, Hong came back. He came back changed. This was visible to his family immediately. Something in his bearing had shifted. There was a new quality to him, a gravity, an inner certainty, something that had not been there before. But Hong himself did not yet explain it. He did not emerge from his illness announcing a divine mission. He simply returned to the life that was available to him, which was the life of a village schoolteacher, and he waited, though he did not yet know he was waiting, for the peace that would make everything make sense. That peace arrived 6 years later. In 1843, Hong made his fourth and final attempt at the provincial examinations. He was 29 years old. The window of realistic candidacy was closing, and when the results came back and his name was not among the successful candidates, something in Hong Xiuquan finally, permanently broke loose from its moorings. He returned home, and this time, in the wreckage of his last reasonable hope, he picked up the pamphlet that had been sitting unread for 7 years. He read it, and the world he had known ceased to exist. The texts in Liang Afa's good words to admonish the age spoke of a heavenly Father, creator of all things, who demanded exclusive worship and condemned the worship of false idols. They spoke of his Son, a divine figure who had come to earth on a redemptive mission. They described heaven as a place of golden light, populated by angels and divine beings. They described the struggle between good and evil as cosmic in scale, with human souls as the prize. And as Hong read these descriptions, the visions he had experienced 6 years earlier in his fever, visions he had never been able to fully account for or explain, suddenly arranged themselves into a coherent picture with the force of a door swinging open. The old man on the golden throne who had given him a sword. That was God the Father, the Heavenly Father. Shangdi, the ancient Chinese name for the supreme deity that Liang Afa's text used as the translation for the Christian God, a choice that resonated deeply with Hong, because Shangdi was a figure from pre-Confucian Chinese religious tradition, ancient and authoritative. The middle-aged man who had fought beside him against the demons, who had called him brother, that was Jesus Christ, the elder brother. And if Jesus was his brother, then Hong Xiuquan was a son of God. Not metaphorically, not in the way that Christian theology speaks of all believers as children of God. Literally, the second son. The younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to earth on a divine commission. It is worth pausing here to consider how this interpretation emerged. Because it was not simply a case of a man reading a religious text and inserting himself into it. The process was more organic, more psychologically complex than that. Hong had experienced something during his illness, something that felt absolutely real, that had the quality of lived experience rather than dream or fantasy. The visions had been vivid enough and consistent enough that they had lodged permanently in his memory. For 6 years he had carried them without a framework, and then Liang Afa's text provided that framework. The fit was imperfect. A careful reading of the Bible would have raised immediate objections to his interpretation, but Hong was not, at this point, a careful biblical scholar. He was a man whose inner experience had just found its explanation. And the explanation that emerged was one that placed him, specifically and uniquely, at the centre of divine history. He began immediately to act on this understanding. He baptized himself and several members of his family and close circle, including his cousin, Hong Rengan, who would later become one of the most important figures in the Taiping movement. He began destroying the traditional religious images in his family home and in the school where he taught, smashing the statues of Confucius, tearing down the ancestral tablets, replacing them with inscriptions honouring the Heavenly Father and the Heavenly Elder Brother. This was not a minor act of personal religious reform. In the context of Chinese society, where ancestor veneration was not merely a religious practice, but a fundamental pillar of social and family organisation, it was a declaration of war against the entire existing order. Hong lost his teaching position almost immediately. His community was scandalised. But Hong was beyond caring about the verdict of the existing order. He had received a higher verdict entirely. He spent the next period deepening his theological understanding. He travelled to Canton and spent several weeks studying with an American Southern Baptist missionary named Issachar Jackox Roberts, who taught him more about Christianity and whom Hong hoped might baptize him formally. Roberts declined, uncertain about Hong's understanding and perhaps sensing something unusual in his interpretation of the faith. The formal baptism never happened. But Hong returned from Canton with a fuller grasp of the biblical text and an even stronger conviction in his own divine identity. He returned to the hills. And he began to preach. The territory where Hong built his movement was Guangxi Province, the rugged, mountainous, chronically neglected western neighbour of his home province of Guangdong. Guangxi was in many ways the perfect incubator for what he was building. It was remote enough that Qing government oversight was minimal and slow to react. It had a large Hakka population with whom Hong shared cultural and linguistic bonds. It had a history of banditry, of secret society activity, of men living outside the formal structures of Qing society. And it had, in the late 1840s, descended into a condition of near total economic and social crisis. The disruptions of the post-Opium War economy had hit hard here. Unemployment was severe. The Hakka-Punti communal conflicts had escalated into organised violence in several areas, producing refugees and displaced families who had lost everything and had no obvious place to go. Into this landscape, Hong preached the God-worshipping society. And he was not alone in building it. He gathered around him a group of men who would become the core leadership of the Taiping movement. And they were remarkable, not in the sense of being saintly, but in the sense of being exactly what the moment required. Yang Shuqing was perhaps the most important of them, a former charcoal burner who was illiterate but possessed of extraordinary organisational talent, charisma, and a ferocious will. Yang would become the East King of the Taiping movement, and eventually its most powerful military and administrative mind. Feng Yunshan was different, quieter, more scholarly, more genuinely devoted to the religious dimension of what they were building. It was Feng who had done much of the initial organisational work in Guangxi, while Hong was elsewhere, patiently building the God-worshipping society from a handful of converts into a movement of thousands. Wei Shanghui and Qin Rigang rounded out the inner circle, men of military capability and absolute commitment who would prove crucial in the years ahead. These were not educated men in the Confucian sense. They had not passed examinations or read the classics, but they understood the world they were operating in with a precision that no Confucian scholar could match. They knew the rhythms of poverty and resentment that governed the lives of the people they were recruiting. They knew how to speak to those people, not in the elevated literary language of the scholar officials, but in the direct, vivid, emotionally immediate language of folk religion and communal experience. And they knew how to organise, how to build structures of loyalty and discipline in a population that had no reason to trust the existing authorities, and every reason to trust someone who claimed to speak for God. The God-worshipping society demanded a great deal from its members: total abandonment of traditional religious practice, no more ancestor worship, no more temple visits, no more offerings to the gods of the Chinese folk religion that had been woven into daily life for millennia. Strict moral discipline, no opium, no alcohol, no gambling, absolute sexual fidelity. Communal property. Members were expected to contribute what they had to a common treasury, the sacred treasury, from which the needs of all would theoretically be met. Separation of men and women in worship and increasingly in daily life. An absolute obedience to the hierarchy of the movement, which was understood not as a human hierarchy, but as a divine one. In return, the movement offered things that the Qing order had never offered the people of southern Guangxi. It offered belonging, the profound, almost physical comfort of being part of a community of shared belief and shared purpose. It offered dignity, the revolutionary declaration that God saw these people, valued these people, had chosen these people for a divine mission. It offered a coherent explanation for suffering. The Qing and their demons had caused this misery, and God's army was going to end it. And it offered, increasingly explicitly, the promise of material transformation, a new world in which land would be distributed equitably, in which the crushing hierarchy of Chinese society would be flattened, in which women would have rights they had never been accorded, in which the outsiders and the marginalized and the desperately poor would inherit a kingdom that God himself had promised them. It spread, faster than anyone, including Hong himself, had anticipated. By 1849 and into 1850, tens of thousands of people had affiliated themselves with the God-worshipping society. They came from every corner of Guangxi's suffering landscape. Miners from the silver mines who had organized themselves into rough fighting units out of economic necessity and now found a divine mandate attached to their organization. Former soldiers and bandits who had the skills to turn a religious community into a military force. Farmers who had lost their land and their livelihoods and had nothing to protect anymore. Women, remarkably, not as peripheral figures but as genuine participants in the movement, some of whom would go on to serve as soldiers and officers in the Taiping armies in a way that shocked everyone who encountered it, including the Western observers who would later marvel at the sight of female battalions fighting in formation. There were also voices speaking through the movement beyond Hong's own. Yang Shuqing, the charcoal burner turned military genius, developed a practice of falling into trances and speaking as the voice of God the Father himself. This was not, within the theological framework of the God-worshipping society, merely a performance. It was understood as genuine divine possession, God speaking directly through Yang to guide the movement. And since God the Father outranked even the heavenly king in the cosmological hierarchy, this gave Yang a remarkable and eventually dangerous power. He could, while in his trance state, give instructions that even Hong Xiuquan could not countermand without appearing to defy God himself. It was a theological time bomb buried at the very heart of the movement. But in those early years, when the community was still gathering itself, and the divine architecture of the new order was still being constructed, it functioned primarily as a source of authority and cohesion. God was speaking. God was guiding them. God was preparing them. For what was becoming increasingly clear by 1850 was that the God-worshipping society was preparing for something more than prayer meetings and communal living. The Qing authorities in Guangxi had noticed the movement and had begun attempting to suppress it, arresting members, confronting groups, trying to disrupt the organizational networks that Feng Yunshan had so carefully built. And the movement had responded not by scattering, but by consolidating. Hong sent word through the network in late 1850, calling all members to gather at Jintian village in the Thistle Mountain area of northern Guangxi. And they came. Thousands of them, with their families and their meagre possessions and their weapons. They came because their homes were already gone, because the Qing forces were already hunting them, because the theological logic of what Hong had been preaching for years pointed inevitably toward this moment. What gathered at Jintian in the closing months of 1850 was not quite an army in any conventional sense. It was a people in motion, a mass of humanity bound together by shared belief and shared desperation, and the particular electric quality that comes when religious conviction and military organization begin to fuse into something new. They drilled, they organized, they prayed together in their thousands, their voices rising into the Guangxi hills in the early morning before the Qing patrols arrived. They awaited the signal that Hong had told them was coming. And on January 11th, 1851, his 37th birthday, Hong Xiuquan gave it. He dressed in yellow robes, the colour of imperial authority, worn by the emperors of China, and now claimed by the man who intended to replace them. He gathered his followers around him, and he declared, in the kind of language that brooks no argument, because it comes wrapped in the authority of heaven itself, that the Taiping Tianguo, the heavenly kingdom of great peace, was now established, that he, Hong Xiuquan, second son of God, younger brother of Jesus Christ, was its heavenly king, and that the demons of the Qing dynasty, the foreign usurpers who had corrupted the sacred land of China and brought suffering to God's chosen people, would be swept away. The crowd that heard this declaration was not a crowd of the powerful. It was not a crowd of generals or scholars or aristocrats. It was a crowd of miners and farmers and charcoal burners and unemployed labourers and women who had never been allowed to matter, and young men who had been told their whole lives that they were worth nothing. And they listened to a man who told them that God disagreed, that God had looked down on the suffering of Guangxi and had sent his own son to set it right, that they were not the forgotten margins of an empire that had abandoned them, but the chosen army of heaven. What happened inside that crowd when those words landed, the specific quality of the feeling that moved through those thousands of people on that January morning in the hills of Guangxi, we cannot fully recover across the distance of nearly 2 centuries. But we can imagine it. The particular combination of terror and exhilaration that comes when something you have believed in private is finally said out loud in public, by a voice with the authority to make it real. The feeling of a door opening, of a life that had been pressing against a wall, finally finding the wall give way. They were not going to build a petition. They were not going to negotiate. They were not going to ask for anything from the dynasty that had taken everything from them. They were going to march. North and east and outward into the vast body of China, fighting for every mile, dying in numbers that would eventually beggar the imagination, carrying with them a vision of a kingdom that God had promised, and that nothing in the world was going to stop them from trying to build. The Taiping Rebellion, in all its terrible and extraordinary fullness, had begun. And the Qing dynasty, vast and ancient and still formidable in appearance, had not yet understood what was coming for it. There is a particular kind of momentum that builds in the early days of a movement that believes itself divinely chosen. It is not simply the momentum of military success, though that matters enormously. It is something deeper and stranger and more difficult to stop. It is the momentum of people who have decided that they cannot lose, who have been told and have chosen to believe with every fibre of their being that the outcome of this struggle was determined before it began, that God has already written the ending and they are simply living their way toward it. This kind of belief does something remarkable to an army. It makes it willing to absorb losses that would shatter a force fighting for ordinary reasons. It makes it capable of marching further, enduring more, sacrificing everything with a completeness that rational calculation cannot produce. And in the early years of the Taiping march north from Guangxi, this quality, this absolute unshakable conviction that heaven was behind them, was perhaps their most devastating weapon. The Qing forces that moved to confront them did not understand this. They understood armies in the conventional sense. They understood numbers and weapons and supply lines and the tactical calculus of positioning and maneuver. What they did not understand was that they were not fighting an army in any conventional sense. They were fighting a people. A people who had burned their boats, abandoned their homes, committed themselves to a path from which there was no return. And that difference in the brutal arithmetic of the early campaigns made itself felt again and again in ways that the Qing commanders could neither predict nor counter. The initial Qing response to the declaration at Jintian was to treat it as what previous disturbances in Guangxi had been, a local problem, manageable with local forces, requiring firm suppression rather than serious military engagement. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The local Qing forces that moved against the gathering at Jintian in early 1851 were poorly equipped, poorly led, and deeply demoralized by decades of institutional decay. The Qing military had not fought a serious war since the campaigns that had expanded the empire's territory in the 18th century. In the intervening decades, it had settled into a condition of comfortable stagnation, collecting salaries, performing ceremonial functions, maintaining the appearance of military readiness while the actual substance of fighting capability quietly rotted away. The officers were often men who had purchased their commissions rather than earned them through demonstrated ability. The soldiers were frequently opium addicts, underpaid and poorly fed, whose primary motivation for service was the modest income it provided rather than any loyalty to the dynasty or commitment to military effectiveness. When these forces met the god-worshippers at Jintian, and in the skirmishes that followed through early 1851, the results were humiliating. The Taiping fighters, though equipped with weapons that were often improvised or captured rather than purpose-built, fought with a ferocity and a unit cohesion that the Qing troops simply could not match. They were not fighting for a salary. They were fighting for God and for their families, and for the new world that Hong Xiuquan had promised them. They took ground and held it. They absorbed casualties and kept coming. And with each small victory, more people joined them, the desperately poor and the dispossessed of Guangxi, drawn by the magnetic pull of a movement that was winning, that was fighting back, that seemed to be doing the impossible. Through 1851, the movement grew and moved. Hong established his command structure formally, creating the system of kings that would govern the Taiping hierarchy throughout its existence. Yang Shuking became the East King, the highest military and administrative authority beneath Hong himself, and the vessel through whom God the Father continued to speak in his trance states. Xiao Caogi became the West King, and was designated the vessel of the heavenly elder brother of Jesus Christ, giving him a divine authority that paralleled Yang's own. Feng Yunshan, the patient builder who had done so much of the foundational organizational work in Guangxi, became the South King. Wei Changhui became the North King, and Hong's older brother Hong Renfu and cousin Qin Rigang received titles as well, the assistant king managing to navigate the increasingly complex inner circle of Taiping leadership with the practical authority of a trusted family member. This system of kings was intended to distribute authority while keeping ultimate power with Hong himself. In practice, it created a structure that was both enormously effective in its early phase and fatally unstable in ways that would not become apparent until much later. In the summer of 1851, the Taiping forces captured Yong'an, a walled town in Guangxi, and held it for several months. This was the first time they had taken and occupied a significant urban settlement, and it revealed something important about what they were building. Inside Yong'an, they began to implement the social program that would define the heavenly kingdom wherever it established itself. Men and women were separated into different living quarters and different military units. The sacred treasury system was enforced, private accumulation of wealth was prohibited, and all goods were theoretically pooled for communal distribution. Traditional religious practices were banned. Opium was banned. Prostitution was banned. A new calendar was introduced, one of the small but symbolically enormous ways in which the Taiping movement declared its complete break with the existing order. The traditional Chinese lunar calendar was replaced with a solar calendar of Taiping devising, a calendar that reorganized not just the measurement of time, but the religious festivals and agricultural rhythms that the existing calendar had governed. To change the calendar was to say, in the most concrete possible terms, that this was a new world, and the old world's ways of marking time no longer applied. The Qing forces besieged Yong'an but could not take it. When the Taiping forces broke out of the siege in the spring of 1852, they did so with the kind of violence and momentum that announced clearly to anyone paying attention that this movement had transcended the category of local rebellion. They moved north through Guangxi toward Hunan province, fighting constantly, taking casualties but absorbing them, leaving behind a landscape that Qing authority had failed to protect. It was during this march that they suffered one of their earliest serious losses. Feng Yunshan, the South King, was killed by artillery fire. It was a grievous blow. Feng had been perhaps the most intellectually grounded of Hong's inner circle, the one most capable of translating the theological vision into practical organizational reality. His death left a gap that would never be entirely filled, and it shifted the balance of power within the leadership subtly but significantly toward Yang Shuqing, whose military genius and political ruthlessness had no equivalent among those who remained. But the movement pressed on, and as it moved north into Hunan, something shifted in its character. Because Hunan was not Guangxi, it was richer, more densely populated, more centrally important to the Qing Empire, and the response it generated was correspondingly greater. The Taiping forces found themselves fighting harder battles against better organized resistance, but they also found something else. A population that was, in many places, just as ready to join them as the people of Guangxi had been. The social pressures that had made Guangxi combustible were not unique to that province. They were present, in varying degrees, across the entire southern half of China. The Opium Crisis. The economic disruption of the post-Opium War settlement, the corruption and ineffectiveness of local Qing administration, the grinding poverty of the rural poor. These conditions had created, across an enormous territory, a population that was hungry for exactly the kind of radical alternative that the Taiping were offering. The city of Changsha, the capital of Hunan province, was besieged but held. The Taiping did not break through its walls, and the siege cost them time and casualties. But they took other towns, absorbed their populations and their resources, and continued moving. And it was on the Shang River and then on the Yangtze, the great rivers that formed the transportation and commercial spine of central China, that the Taiping discovered the dimension of their campaign that would transform them from a formidable rebellion into something that threatened to overturn the dynasty entirely. They captured boats, hundreds of them, then thousands. The rivers of central China were dense with commercial traffic, grain boats, merchant vessels, fishing craft of every description, and as the Taiping swept through river town after river town, they absorbed this floating infrastructure into their campaign. From a land army fighting its way through mountain passes and rice paddies, they became an amphibious force capable of moving large numbers of troops and supplies with a speed and efficiency that the Qing forces, locked into their slow and corrupt land-based logistics, could not match. In December of 1852, they took Yueshu on the shores of Dongting Lake, and with it an enormous cache of weapons and ammunition that had been stored there, including artillery pieces that dramatically expanded their military capability. The scale of the force was now staggering. From the tens of thousands who had gathered at Jintian, the Taiping had grown through constant recruitment and the absorption of the populations of captured territories to somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, a vast, mobile community that was simultaneously an army, a government, a religious congregation, and a society in motion. They moved along the Yangtze with a fleet of thousands of boats carrying soldiers and camp followers and the sacred treasury and the administrative apparatus of the Heavenly Kingdom, a moving city on water that stretched for miles along the river and announced its approach to everything downstream. In January of 1853, they took Wuhan, or rather the three linked cities of Wuchang, Hankou, and Hanyang, that together formed one of the most strategically important urban complexes in China. The fall of Wuhan sent shockwaves through the Qing court in Beijing that were unlike anything since the Opium War. Wuhan sat at the very centre of China, at the junction of the Yangtze and Han rivers, controlling the flow of commerce and military movement across the middle of the country. Its fall meant that the Taiping were no longer a southern problem. They were a national emergency. The emperor in Beijing declared a state of crisis. Emergency funds were mobilized. Commanders were dispatched with stern instructions to stop the advance. They did not stop it. The Taiping paused at Wuhan for only a few weeks before pressing on downstream along the Yangtze, moving east toward their ultimate objective. And that objective, which Hong Xiuquan and his inner circle had been moving toward since the declaration at Jintian 2 years before, was the city that sat at the heart of Chinese history like a great jewel in the river's bend, Nanjing, the southern capital. The city that had served as the capital of Chinese dynasties before the Qing, and that carried, in its name and its history and its walls, an authority and a legitimacy that no other city in China except Beijing itself could claim. If the Taiping could take Nanjing, they would have a capital worthy of the Heavenly Kingdom. They would have the symbolic heart of a rival Chinese civilization to set against the Manchu occupiers in Beijing. They would have demonstrated, in the most concrete possible terms, that the Qing dynasty could not protect its own country. The march from Wuhan to Nanjing took less than a month. The river carried them east with terrifying speed, and the Qing forces that attempted to stop them at various points along the way found themselves outmaneuvered, outfought, or simply overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what was coming. Towns fell, garrisons broke and ran, and on March 8, 1853, the Taiping vanguard arrived before the walls of Nanjing. The city was defended by a Qing garrison that was brave enough but completely inadequate to the task of holding walls 12 miles in circumference against a force of hundreds of thousands. The Taiping engineers, many of them miners from Guangxi, who had made the entire journey with the movement, and who understood explosives with a professional intimacy, tunnelled beneath the massive walls and packed the tunnels with gunpowder. On March 19, they detonated the charges. 2 great sections of Nanjing's ancient walls blew outward in clouds of dust and debris, and through the gaps the Taiping poured. The fighting inside the city was fierce but brief. The Manchu garrison, understanding that no quarter would be offered. The Taiping policy toward Manchu soldiers was extermination, rooted in Hong's theology that cast them as literal demons, fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were going to die. Many of them were killed. Others took their own lives and the lives of their families rather than be captured. The Han Chinese population of Nanjing, many of whom had long resented Manchu rule, was treated differently, not as enemies, but as people to be liberated and incorporated into the Heavenly Kingdom. And then it was over. Nanjing was in Taiping hands. Hong Xiuquan, the failed examination candidate from a Hakka farming village in Guangdong, rode into the southern capital of China at the head of an army that had marched nearly 1,000 miles in 2 years, fighting every step of the way, and had just seized one of the most historically significant cities in the world. He renamed it Tianjin, the heavenly capital. And there, within its walls, the heavenly kingdom of great peace began the extraordinary experiment of trying to actually govern. What the Taiping built in Nanjing was unlike anything China had seen. It was a state constructed on paper that was simultaneously utopian and brutal, innovative and rigid, inspired and deeply confused. The theological framework that Hong had developed over the previous decade provided the organizing logic for everything. Every administrative decision, every social policy, every legal code derived its authority from the divine order that God had commanded Hong to establish on earth. And that divine order, as Hong understood it, was radical in ways that went far beyond anything the Qing dynasty or any previous Chinese state had attempted. The most striking of the Taiping social policies, to contemporary observers and to historians ever since, was the treatment of women. In a society where women were bound feet and all, confined to the domestic sphere, excluded from public life, bought and sold in marriage markets that treated them as property, the Taiping position was revolutionary. Foot binding was banned outright, which alone was enough to mark the movement as dangerously subversive in the eyes of the Confucian establishment. Women were organized into their own military units, female battalions that drilled and fought with a discipline that astonished Western observers who encountered them. Women could hold administrative positions within the Taiping government. The buying and selling of women as concubines was prohibited. In the Heavenly Kingdom, at least in theory, a woman was a person with rights and a role in the divine plan rather than a commodity in the social economy. Land policy was equally radical. The Taiping issued a document called the Land System of the Heavenly Dynasty, which laid out a vision of agrarian reform that was breathtaking in its ambition. All land in the Heavenly Kingdom would be distributed equally, based on the number of mouths in each family rather than on the existing pattern of ownership. No family would hold more than another. The surplus production of each family, beyond what was needed for its own subsistence, would flow into the sacred treasury for communal distribution. Poverty in this system was not merely to be ameliorated, it was to be abolished. Every person in the Heavenly Kingdom would have enough, because God's kingdom could not tolerate the obscene inequalities of the Qing order. The sacred treasury system extended beyond land. All goods, all money, all the material output of the Heavenly Kingdom was theoretically communal property. Private wealth was not merely discouraged, but theologically condemned, a remnant of the demonic order that the Taiping had come to replace. In practice, as with so much of the Taiping program, the gap between the ideal and the reality was enormous. The sacred treasury system functioned reasonably well in the early phase of the movement, when everyone was poor and everyone's contribution was roughly equivalent. As the Heavenly Kingdom expanded and its leadership class grew wealthy on the spoils of conquest, the communal ideal quietly hollowed out at the top, while being rigidly enforced at the bottom. But in its stated form, as a vision of what human society could be, if organised according to God's intentions rather than the devil's arrangements, it was genuinely extraordinary. Religious life in the Heavenly Kingdom was governed with equal thoroughness. The traditional Chinese religious landscape, with its layered coexistence of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and folk religion, was swept away entirely. Temples were destroyed. Buddhist and Taoist monks and nuns were ordered to return to lay life. Ancestral tablets, those small wooden boards that stood in every Chinese home as the focal point of the most intimate religious practice most people engaged in, were burned. The Confucian classics, which had formed the intellectual and moral foundation of Chinese civilization for 2,000 years, and which the examination system Hong had failed to master, was built upon, were either banned outright or reissued in edited form with passages that conflicted with Taiping theology, removed or revised. The Taiping were not merely offering an alternative religion. They were attempting to erase the existing religious and moral order completely and replace it with their own. This was enormously appealing to some people, particularly to those who had reason to resent the Confucian order, which meant in practice the poor, women, those outside the scholar gentry class whose social position depended on Confucian hierarchy. But it was deeply alienating to others, particularly to the educated elite, whose entire sense of identity and purpose was rooted in the classical tradition that the Taiping were destroying. The scholar gentry of the Yangtze Valley, the class that produced the local administrators, the magistrates, the teachers, the community leaders who actually made Chinese society function at the local level, watched the Taiping advance with a horror that went beyond political opposition into something closer to existential terror. The Taiping were not just threatening their privileges, they were threatening to erase the entire civilizational framework within which their lives had meaning. And this would prove in time to be one of the most important factors in the Taiping's ultimate defeat. But in 1853, in the months following the fall of Nanjing, defeat seemed very far away. The Heavenly Kingdom was at the height of its power and its possibility. Nanjing was being rebuilt according to the Taiping vision, new administrative buildings, new religious spaces, the infrastructure of a functioning capital city being erected within the ancient walls. Hong Xiuquan moved into the former Qing governor's palace, which was rebuilt and expanded into the Heavenly Palace, a complex of considerable magnificence that the Heavenly King had filled with a court of thousands of women and attendants. This was, already, a tension at the heart of the movement. The Heavenly King who had banned opium and prostitution and the buying of women and preached the equality of all people before God was now living in a palace surrounded by concubines, increasingly isolated from the reality of the kingdom he had founded and the war he had started. The military campaign had not stopped with the capture of Nanjing. Two major expeditions were launched almost immediately. The northern expedition pushed up through Anhui and Henan provinces toward Beijing itself, an audacious thrust aimed at decapitating the Qing dynasty by taking its capital. The western expedition moved back up the Yangtze to consolidate Taiping control over the Middle River Valley and secure the agricultural heartland that the Heavenly Kingdom needed to sustain itself. Both expeditions were commanded by able generals and manned by experienced fighters, and both revealed, in different ways, the strengths and the limitations that would define the Taiping military effort through the remainder of the rebellion. The northern expedition was extraordinary in its ambition and ultimately heartbreaking in its outcome. A force of somewhere between 50 and 100,000 fighters pushed north through territory that Qing forces had held for 2 centuries, winning battle after battle, moving with a speed that consistently outpaced the Qing response. They reached the outskirts of Tianjin, the port city that served as Beijing's maritime gateway, and for a moment in late 1853, the Qing court in the capital genuinely feared that the dynasty was about to fall. But the northern expedition had pushed beyond the range of its supply lines and beyond the geographic limits of Taiping's strength. The northern Chinese landscape, the flat, cold, wheat-growing plains of the north, was culturally and physically alien territory for fighters who had grown up in the subtropical south. The local population, who were predominantly Han, but who had a different dialect, different customs, different grievances than the southerners who formed the core of the Taiping army, did not rise to join them the way the people of Guangxi and Hunan had. The Qing, fighting on their home ground with short supply lines, managed to encircle and eventually destroy the northern expedition over a grinding campaign that lasted nearly 2 years. The last remnants of the northern army were annihilated in 1855. It was the Taiping's first catastrophic military defeat, and it foreclosed permanently the possibility of a quick decapitation of the Qing dynasty. The western expedition fared better. The middle Yangtze Valley, the provinces of Hunan, Hubei, Anhui, Jiangxi, became a vast contested battleground where Taiping and Qing forces struggled for control through years of brutal attritional warfare. The Taiping held Nanjing and a substantial territory around it. They controlled significant stretches of the Yangtze and its tributaries. They administered a population of millions. They governed, taxed, conscripted, prayed, and fought on a scale that made them not a rebellion but a state, a genuine rival government contending for the mandate of heaven that the Qing had claimed since 1644. And in Nanjing, in the heavenly palace, Hong Xiuquan watched it all from an increasing distance. The man who had marched from Guangxi at the head of his people, who had preached in the mountain villages and baptized converts in the rivers, and walked into battle with the absolute conviction of divine purpose. That man had begun, almost from the moment he entered his capital, to withdraw. He spent more and more time inside the palace. He relied more and more on the interpretations of scripture and divine will that he issued in written proclamations rather than direct engagement with his commanders and administrators. The day-to-day governance of the heavenly kingdom, the military strategy, the administrative decisions, the management of the vast and complex enterprise that the Taiping state had become, fell increasingly to Yang Shuqing. And Yang Shuqing, the former charcoal burner who spoke with the voice of God the Father in his trance states, and who possessed a military and administrative intelligence that was genuinely formidable, was accumulating power with a thoroughness and an appetite that would eventually make open conflict between him and the heavenly king inevitable. He managed the Taiping armies with remarkable effectiveness. He reorganized the administrative apparatus of the heavenly kingdom. He handled diplomatic contacts with the Western powers who were beginning to take a serious interest in the rebellion. British and American and French observers who arrived in Nanjing to assess whether the Taiping were a legitimate Christian movement that deserved Western support, and who came away with complicated and often deeply ambivalent conclusions. The Western observers found much that was familiar in the Taiping religious practice: the prayers, the hymns, the reverence for the Bible, the prohibition on opium that aligned perfectly with the moral concerns of Western missionaries. But they also found things that troubled them deeply. The claim that Hong Xiuquan was the younger brother of Jesus Christ was theologically impossible by any Orthodox Christian standard. The violence of the Taiping advance, the destruction of Buddhist and Taoist temples, the enforced separation of men and women, the absolute and uncompromising demand for conformity to the Taiping religious program. These were not what the Western missionaries had in mind when they distributed their pamphlets in the streets of Canton. The early hope that the Taiping might be a kind of Chinese Protestant Reformation, a movement that would open China to Christian civilization from within, gave way gradually to something more uncertain and more troubled. But the Western powers, in these early years, did not intervene against the Taiping. They maintained a formal neutrality that in practice allowed the rebellion to continue its extraordinary experiment in the middle of China. They traded with both sides. They watched. They calculated their interests, and they waited to see which way the war would go before committing themselves to any course of action that could not be undone. Meanwhile, in the great walled city on the Yangtze, the heavenly kingdom continued to breathe and grow and fight. Its armies held their territory against a Qing counteroffensive that was slowly, painfully, beginning to organize itself into something more effective than the corrupt and demoralized force that had failed so badly in the early campaigns. New Qing commanders were emerging, men who understood that the old military system could not beat the Taiping, and who were building something new, based on regional loyalty and local financing, and a quality of leadership that the imperial army had not seen in generations. The most important of these was a scholar official from Hunan named Zheng Guofan, who was in the process of building what would become known as the Xiang Army, a force funded by the Hunan gentry, officered by men of genuine ability and commitment, and motivated by exactly the Confucian cultural loyalty that the Taiping's destruction of the classical tradition had inflamed into something approaching a holy war of its own. But that confrontation was still gathering itself, still building toward the force it would eventually become. In 1853 and 1854 and into 1855, the heavenly kingdom held, It administered its territory, collected its taxes, enforced its moral code, educated its children in Taiping scripture, organized its female battalions, distributed land according to the divine program, and continued to fight the dynasty that it had declared itself the replacement for. It was imperfect. It was contradictory. It was shot through with tensions between the ideal and the reality, between the theological vision and the human material available to realize it. But it was also, in its way, remarkable, a genuine attempt by people who had been told their whole lives that they did not matter, to build a world in which they did. A world ordained by heaven and constructed on earth by the hands of farmers and miners and charcoal burners and women whose feet had never been bound. Whether that world could survive the forces already gathering against it, from outside, where the Qing were learning and adapting, and from inside, where the ambitions and the grievances and the theological time bombs built into the Taiping leadership structure were quietly ticking toward detonation, was a question that the heavenly kingdom had not yet had to answer. It would not have to wait much longer. There is a particular kind of tragedy that belongs exclusively to movements that destroy themselves, not the tragedy of being overwhelmed by a superior enemy, or of being ground down by forces too large to resist, or of simply running out of time and resources and luck. Those are painful endings, but they carry within them a kind of dignity. The dignity of having fought until there was nothing left to fight with. The tragedy that belongs to the Taiping heavenly kingdom is different, and in some ways harder to sit with. Because the heavenly kingdom, at the height of its power, with its armies holding the Yangtze Valley, and its capital secure behind ancient walls, and its social experiment still alive and still breathing, did not simply face its enemies. It turned inward. It took the knife that its enemies could not yet plunge into its heart, and it found a way to plunge it there itself. And what came out of that wound was something that no army from outside could have produced, a hemorrhage of leadership and trust and cohesion so severe that the movement never fully recovered from it. The enemies outside could wait. The rot inside could not. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the structure that Hong Xiuquan built at the very beginning, the system of kings, the theological architecture of the heavenly kingdom that distributed divine authority among a small group of men who were each, in their own way, convinced of their unique relationship to heaven. Because that architecture, which had been such a source of strength in the early years, giving the movement multiple capable leaders, multiple sources of inspiration, multiple channels through which God's will could be communicated to the faithful, contained within it a flaw so fundamental that it is almost impossible to understand how no one saw it coming. Though perhaps they did see it, perhaps they simply believed, as people in movements like this always tend to believe, that the divine framework that bound them together would prove stronger than the human ambitions that were always pressing against it. It would not. Yang Xiuqing had always been the most powerful personality in the Taiping leadership after Hong himself. From the earliest days in Guangxi, his combination of organizational genius, military instinct, and raw force of will had made him indispensable in ways that no one else in the inner circle could match. He had built the logistical systems that kept the army moving. He had made the key tactical decisions that had carried the rebellion from Guangxi to Nanjing. He had managed the administration of the heavenly kingdom in Nanjing with a thoroughness that Hong, retreating into his palace and his theological meditations, had long since ceased to provide. And he had done all of this while also serving as the vessel of God the Father, the human mouthpiece, through whom the Heavenly Father spoke directly to the movement in those trance states that the Taiping theological framework had established as channels of divine communication. That last role was, in retrospect, the most dangerous thing about Yang Xiuqing, because it meant that his authority was not merely political or military, it was cosmic. When Yang fell into his trance and the voice of God the Father emerged from his lips, no one in the heavenly kingdom, not even Hong Xiuquan himself, could contradict what was said without appearing to contradict God. And Yang had used this authority, carefully at first and then with increasing boldness, to accumulate a power that effectively made him the operational ruler of the heavenly kingdom, while Hong remained its theological figurehead. He gave orders in God's name. He settled disputes in God's name. He disciplined officials, redirected military resources, managed diplomatic contacts with the Western powers, all of it sanctioned by the divine voice that spoke through him, and that no one had the theological standing to challenge. For years, Hong had accepted this arrangement because it worked. Yang's competence was genuine, and the movement needed it. But as the years in Nanjing accumulated, and the distance between Hong's palace world and the reality of the heavenly kingdom grew, something else was accumulating too. Yang's ambition. His appetite for the power he had already effectively seized was growing toward a desire for something more formal, more permanent, more officially recognized. He wanted a title, not just the East King, not just the vessel of God the Father, but something that acknowledged what everyone in Nanjing already understood, that he was, in every practical sense that mattered, the first man of the heavenly kingdom. In the summer of 1856, he made his move. He fell into one of his divine trance states and, speaking as the voice of God the Father, delivered a message to Hong Xiuquan that contained a demand so audacious that it must have seemed, in the moment, almost unbelievable. He demanded that Hong grant him the title of Wan Sui, 10,000 years, the honorific traditionally reserved exclusively for the emperor. It was, in the language of Chinese political culture, a demand to be recognized as a co-emperor, an equal, a second heavenly king, in all but name. Hong Xiuquan, alone in his palace, surrounded by his court and his concubines and his theological certainties, understood exactly what was being asked, and he made a calculation. He agreed. He granted the title. He gave Yang Shuking what he asked for. And then, immediately and secretly, he sent word to the two kings who were closest to him and most loyal to his personal authority, Wei Changhui, the North King, and Qin Rigang, the Assistant King, summoning them back to Nanjing. The message he sent them was not recorded in any document that survived, but what happened next makes its content entirely clear. Wei Changhui arrived in Nanjing in September of 1856 with his army. He arrived at night. He moved through the city in the darkness with a thoroughness and a violence that announced from the first moment that this was not a political negotiation or a theological dispute to be settled by debate. It was a massacre. Yang Shuking was killed, the vessel of God the Father, the East King, the man who had built the Taiping military machine from a mob of desperate farmers into a force that had seized the Yangtze Valley, was cut down in the city he had effectively ruled. And Yang did not die alone. His entire household was killed. His associates were killed, his followers, his supporters, the networks of loyalty that he had built over years within the Taiping administration. They were hunted through the streets of Nanjing and killed with a comprehensiveness that the sources describe as involving somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 deaths. In a single night and the days that followed, the East King and a significant fraction of the heavenly kingdom's experienced administrative and military leadership were wiped from the earth. The event is known in Chinese history as the Tianjin Incident. And it was, without question, the moment the Taiping Rebellion began to die. Not immediately. The movement would continue for another 8 years, fighting battles of extraordinary ferocity, holding territory, generating moments of genuine military brilliance. But the Tianjin Incident broke something in the heavenly kingdom that could not be repaired. It destroyed the unity of the inner circle that had been, for all its tensions and power struggles, the organizational core of the movement. It consumed in a single convulsion of violence the administrative talent and institutional memory that Yang Shuking had spent years building. It revealed to the world, to the Qing dynasty watching from the north, to the Western powers calculating their interests, to the millions of people living under Taiping rule who had believed in the divine sanction of the movement's leadership, that the heavenly kingdom was not a kingdom of heaven at all. It was a human enterprise, driven by human ambitions and human jealousies and human cruelties, capable of destroying itself from within with the same ferocity it had turned outward against its enemies. Hong Xiuquan's response to the aftermath made everything worse. Wei Changhui and Qin Rigang, having done what they understood Hong to have summoned them to do, found themselves facing a heavenly king who appeared to recoil from the full consequences of what had been unleashed. Another of the original kings, Shi Dekai, the assistant king, who was perhaps the most militarily gifted of all the Taiping commanders, had arrived in Nanjing in the wake of the massacre and had confronted Hong with the horror of what had happened. Shi Dekai narrowly escaped being killed himself. He fled the capital. And in response to Shi Dekai's outrage and the broader crisis of confidence that the massacre had triggered, Hong had Wei Changhui and Qin Rigang executed, the men who had carried out his own order, killed now to provide a scapegoat for the catastrophe that order had created. The signal this sent through the Taiping leadership was devastating. The heavenly king had summoned his kings, used them as instruments of murder, and then killed them for it. The message was clear to everyone who had eyes to see it. Loyalty to Hong Xiuquan was not a guarantee of safety. It was not even a guarantee of survival long enough to be punished for someone else's mistake. The inner circle that had made the heavenly kingdom possible was gone, and what replaced it was a court culture of suspicion and self-protection in which the most rational strategy for survival was to stay as far from Hong's attention as possible. Shi Dekai, the one genuinely great military mind who remained alive and free after the Tianjin incident, made exactly that calculation. He gathered his army and left Nanjing, taking with him somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 of the Taiping's best fighters on an independent campaign that would wander through western and southwestern China for the next 7 years, winning battles and losing battles, and never quite finding the decisive engagement that might have changed its outcome, until it was finally cornered and destroyed in Sichuan province in 1863. Shi Dekai himself surrendered in an attempt to save his remaining soldiers and was executed by the Qing with the prolonged cruelty reserved for the most dangerous enemies of the dynasty. His departure from Nanjing in 1857 was another wound from which the heavenly kingdom would not recover, not the killing blow, but a hemorrhage that ran alongside all the others. Into the vacuum left by the Tianjin incident, Hong Xiuquan brought his family. His brothers and nephews and relatives by blood and by marriage were elevated into the positions of power that the massacre and Shi Dekai's departure had emptied. These men, chosen for the accident of their kinship with the heavenly king, rather than for any demonstrated competence, proceeded to govern with exactly the quality of leadership that nepotism in crisis conditions typically produces. They were corrupt, self-serving, incompetent, and interested primarily in the privileges of their positions, rather than the responsibilities that came with them. The sacred treasury that had once pooled the resources of the movement for communal use was systematically plundered by the new leadership class. The moral code that had been the Taiping's most radical and most genuinely admirable feature, the prohibition on opium, the protection of women, the attempt to abolish poverty, was increasingly enforced only on those too powerless to resist it, while being quietly abandoned by those with enough rank to exempt themselves. And outside the walls of Nanjing, while the heavenly kingdom hollowed itself from within, the forces arrayed against it were doing something that no enemy of the Taiping had previously managed. They were learning. Zheng Guofan had been building the Xiang army since 1852, and by the late 1850s it had become something qualitatively different from anything the Qing military establishment had previously fielded. It was not an imperial army in the traditional sense, it was a regional force, funded by the tax revenues of Hunan province and the donations of the Hunan gentry, officered almost entirely by men whom Zheng had personally recruited and personally trusted, built on bonds of personal loyalty and Confucian moral conviction, rather than the imperial bureaucratic structures that had produced so many useless commanders. Zheng understood something that the Qing court had been slow to grasp, that the Taiping could only be beaten by a force that matched their motivation and exceeded their organization, that the corrupt and demoralized imperial banner armies were incapable of doing this and would have to be replaced by something new. And so he built something new, paying his soldiers properly, selecting his officers for ability rather than seniority or purchase, instilling in the whole enterprise the Confucian cultural mission that gave the gentry class its reason to fight, the defense of the classical civilization that the Taiping were trying to destroy. The Xiang army lost battles. It suffered reverses so severe that Zheng Wufan reportedly attempted suicide on 2 occasions when his river fleet was destroyed by the Taiping and his plans collapsed. But it learned from its failures in a way that the Qing imperial forces had never done. It adapted, it improved, and it kept coming back. The same persistence that had made the Taiping so formidable in their early campaigns, the refusal to accept defeat as final, was now being turned against them by an enemy who had studied them carefully, and who understood that the war would be decided not by a single dramatic battle, but by the slow, grinding accumulation of pressure on every front simultaneously. By the late 1850s, the Xiang army and its affiliated forces were pressing hard on the Taiping position in the Yangtze Valley. Jiangxi province, which the Taiping had held since the Western expedition, was being contested with increasing ferocity. Anhui province, north of Nanjing, was becoming a killing ground where Taiping and Qing forces fought for control of the river towns and agricultural land that both sides needed to sustain their campaigns. The Taiping still held Nanjing. They still controlled significant territory. They could still generate military offensives of considerable power when they had the commanders and the resources to mount them. But the strategic momentum, that quality of unstoppable forward movement that had carried them from Guangxi to the southern capital in 2 years, was gone. They were fighting now, not to advance, but to survive. And into this deteriorating military situation came a new element that altered the character of the conflict in ways that neither side had anticipated. The Western powers, who had maintained their careful neutrality through the 1850s, while calculating their interests with the precision that imperial powers bring to other people's wars, made a decision, not all at once, not with a single declared policy, but through a series of choices and events that gradually moved them from observers to participants. And when the West intervened, it intervened against the Taiping. The immediate trigger was the Second Opium War of 1856 to 1860, a conflict that Britain and France launched against the Qing dynasty to force further trade concessions and extend the privileges that the First Opium War had established. It was, in the most naked possible terms, a war of imperial aggression, a powerful industrial nation using military force to compel a weaker state to accept conditions that served the aggressor's commercial interests. British and French forces attacked Chinese coastal fortifications, sailed up the Peiho River, and eventually occupied Beijing itself, burning the magnificent old summer palace in an act of cultural vandalism so complete that its ruins still stand today as a monument to the encounter between Western power and Chinese civilization. The Qing court fled. And then the Qing court, desperate for breathing room, signed treaties that gave the Western powers almost everything they wanted: more treaty ports, more trading rights, legalization of the opium trade that was still bleeding Chinese society dry, the right to station Western diplomats in Beijing itself. What the Second Opium War did, paradoxically, was align Western interests with Qing survival. The treaty system that the Western powers had forced on the Qing gave them access to the Chinese market on terms they could not have obtained from any Taiping government. The Heavenly Kingdom's theological hostility to the opium trade, its unpredictable religious government, its radical social program that disrupted the commercial networks the Western merchants depended on. None of this made the Taiping an attractive alternative to a weakened Qing dynasty that had just demonstrated, by signing whatever was put in front of it, that it would do whatever the Western powers required. A Qing emperor was a known quantity, a manageable partner, a source of commercial concessions. A heavenly king who believed himself the son of God, and whose movement banned opium and sequestered communal property, was something else entirely. The shift in Western policy expressed itself first through the activities of private soldiers of fortune operating in the chaos of the Yangtze Delta. Frederick Townsend Ward was an American from Salem, Massachusetts, a man of restless energy and considerable military talent, who had served in various armies and navies before fetching up in Shanghai in the late 1850s, with the particular combination of skills and moral flexibility that the situation seemed to require. Ward began recruiting a small force of Western adventurers and Filipino mercenaries to serve the Qing cause in the defense of Shanghai and the towns surrounding it against Taiping advances. The force was small at first, and its early operations were modest. But Ward was a gifted organizer and a natural leader of irregular troops, and he had identified something that the Qing had not yet grasped, that a small, well-trained, well-led force, equipped with modern weapons, could consistently defeat much larger Taiping armies that lacked both the training and the equipment. Ward's force evolved rapidly. The Western mercenaries proved more trouble than they were worth, drunken, insubordinable, expensive, and prone to desertion. Ward replaced them with Chinese soldiers, recruited locally and trained to Western standards of drill and discipline. Equipped with modern rifles and artillery, and led by Ward himself and a small cadre of Western officers. The results were remarkable. This force, which the Chinese press named the Ever-Victorious Army, a name that had more propaganda value than literal accuracy, began winning battles against the Taiping around Shanghai with a consistency that the Qing imperial forces in the same theatre could not match. It was small, never more than 5,000 men at its peak, but it was a scalpel in a war that had previously been fought with blunt instruments, and it cut with a precision that the Taiping found deeply unsettling. Ward was killed in battle in 1862 at the age of 30. His death created a vacuum that the Qing government needed to fill quickly, and the man who stepped into it was one of the most remarkable figures the entire conflict produced. Charles George Gordon was a British Army officer, a Royal Engineer, a man of intense religious conviction and personal courage, and the kind of eccentric brilliance that the Victorian British military occasionally generated and never quite knew what to do with. Gordon took command of the Ever-Victorious Army in 1863 and immediately stamped it with his personality, personally leading attacks while carrying only a rattan cane, refusing to allow the looting that other commanders tolerated, applying a combination of tactical intelligence and personal fearlessness that inspired his men and baffled his enemies. Gordon coordinated his operations with Zheng Guofan's overall strategy and with the forces of Li Hongsang, the Shang army commander, who was becoming one of the most important military and political figures in late Qing China. Together, these forces, Zheng's Shang army pressing from the west and south, Li Hongshang's Anhui army pushing from the north, and Gordon's Ever-Victorious Army operating in the Yangtze Delta east of Nanjing, constituted a closing ring around the heavenly kingdom that was, by 1863, tightening with a slowness that was almost geological and a thoroughness that was becoming impossible to escape. Inside Nanjing, Hong Xiuquan had retreated so completely into his palace world that his disconnection from reality had become almost total. He issued proclamations in the elaborate theological language of the heavenly kingdom, offering divine guidance and scriptural interpretation, while his generals begged for reinforcements and supplies and strategic direction that never came. He promoted and demoted officials with a randomness that reflected the court politics of the palace rather than the military needs of the campaign. He ate, it was said, with the appetite of a man untouched by the famine that was beginning to grip the city. The Qing siege lines were tightening. The supply routes that had fed Nanjing were being cut one by one, and the population inside the walls was beginning to feel the specific, grinding misery of a city that cannot be fed. Yet even in this darkening situation, the Taiping were not finished. They had one more commander of genuine ability, one more opportunity to demonstrate that the movement that had marched from Guangxi was not yet spent. His name was Li Shucheng, the loyal king, and he was perhaps the greatest military talent the Taiping produced, more practically gifted than the dead Yang Shuking, more loyal than the departed Shi Dekai, more effective in the field than anyone else who remained in the Heavenly Kingdom's service. Li Shucheng had been fighting the Taiping's battles in the Yangtze Delta for years, and he had done it with a skill and a persistence that had repeatedly frustrated the Qing and their Western allies. In 1860, he had launched an audacious campaign that had lifted a previous Qing siege of Nanjing, taking the besieging forces from the rear with a speed and coordination that remains impressive even by the standards of military history. He had captured Hangzhou and Suzhou, the beautiful silk cities south of Nanjing, expanding the Taiping territorial base in the delta at the moment when the Qing had thought they had the initiative. But Li Shucheng was one man commanding armies that were increasingly starved of resources, facing a coalition that learned from every engagement, in a war whose strategic momentum had definitively shifted. The fall of Suzhou in late 1863 to the combined forces of Gordon and Li Hongshang was a turning point of the most brutal kind. The Taiping commanders of Suzhou had negotiated a surrender that they believed would spare their lives. Gordon had agreed to terms. But Li Hongshang, who commanded the overall Qing force in the area and who had his own calculations about what the end of the rebellion should look like, ordered the surrendered Taiping commanders executed anyway. Gordon was furious. He felt his personal honour had been compromised by the violation of terms he had helped negotiate, and the incident created a diplomatic crisis between him and Li Hongshang that briefly threatened to unravel the entire Western participation in the campaign. But the military reality was unaffected by Gordon's outrage. Suzhou was in Qing hands, the ring around Nanjing was tighter, and the loyal king, fighting with everything he had to hold what remained of the Heavenly Kingdom together, was running out of road. Through 1863 and into 1864, town after town in the Taiping territories fell. The armies that had once seemed unstoppable were being ground down by the steady, remorseless pressure of the Shang army and its allies. Supply lines were cut. Reinforcements did not arrive. Populations that had supported the Taiping out of genuine conviction or practical necessity began to calculate the odds and make their accommodations with whoever would be governing them next. The sacred cause that had once seemed to carry the authority of heaven was beginning to look, from the ground level of a hungry provincial town, watching Qing armies approach and Taiping armies retreat, like a cause that heaven had perhaps reconsidered. In Nanjing, the Heavenly King was dying. Not from the siege, not from violence, but from illness. The specific illness is disputed by historians, some suggesting disease, others suggesting that the privations of the increasingly blockaded city had finally penetrated even the walls of the Heavenly Palace. Hong Xiuquan, who had in his final months reportedly eaten wild vegetables when the food ran out, and told his starving people that they too should eat them, because God would provide, who had continued to issue proclamations of divine confidence even as the walls of his kingdom closed in around him, died on June 1st, 1864. He died without seeing the end, without having to watch the city that his vision had built fall to the forces that his vision had failed to defeat. In that narrow sense, he was spared the final act. But the final act was coming, and the loyal king, and the remnants of the heavenly kingdom, and the millions of people who had lived and died within its boundaries, were not going to be spared anything. Hong Tianguifu, Hong Shuquan's teenage son, was proclaimed the new heavenly king. He was a boy in a burning building, elevated to a throne that had already ceased to mean anything. Li Shusheng, the loyal king, organized the defense of Nanjing with the resources still available to him, which were desperately inadequate to the task. The Shang army had completed its encirclement. The mines were being dug beneath the walls. The city that had fallen to Taiping explosives 11 years before was about to fall to the same method in reverse. And the suffering of the people inside those walls, in those final months of the siege, the hunger, the disease, the grinding daily reality of a city that had been promised heaven and was receiving something entirely different, was already becoming one of the most terrible chapters of a war that was full of terrible chapters. It would end. But not gently. And not yet. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows the end of something enormous. Not the silence of peace, which is soft and expansive and carries within it the feeling of space opening up, but the silence of aftermath, the silence that settles over a landscape when the noise that has filled it for years suddenly stops, and what remains is not quiet, but emptiness. The specific, heavy emptiness of a world that has been unmade and has not yet found a new shape to inhabit. That is the silence that settled over the Yangtze Valley in the summer of 1864, over the burned cities and the depopulated provinces, and the mass graves that dotted the landscape from Guangxi to the Delta like a terrible punctuation to everything that had happened. Over a China that had consumed itself in 14 years of war, and come out the other side so profoundly damaged that the full extent of what had been lost would take generations to begin to understand. But before the silence, before the aftermath, there was still the end to get through. And the end, when it came to Nanjing in the summer of 1864, came in the way that so much of this war had come, with fire and explosives and a violence so comprehensive that it left almost nothing standing that had stood before. The Xiang army had been tightening its grip on Nanjing through the first half of 1864, with the methodical patience that Zheng Guofan had made the signature of his entire campaign. He was not a man who took unnecessary risks. He had learnt through years of painful experience and near catastrophic defeats that the Taiping were most dangerous when you gave them room to maneuver, most vulnerable when you pressed them on every side simultaneously, and denied them the ability to concentrate their remaining strength at a single point. So he pressed. He cut supply routes. He tightened the ring. He let hunger and disease work alongside his armies as instruments of siege, understanding that a city that cannot be fed will eventually fall regardless of how many soldiers defend its walls. Inside Nanjing, the situation through the spring of 1864 had deteriorated from desperate to something beyond the reach of ordinary adjectives. The food was gone, not reduced, not rationed, but gone in the way that only a prolonged siege in a pre-industrial city can produce. People were eating whatever could be found: grass, roots, leather, things that human beings in ordinary circumstances would not consider food. Disease moved through the weakened population with the freedom that malnutrition always grants it. The streets of the heavenly capital, which had once been laid out according to the divine geometry of the Taiping administrative vision, and filled with the life of a city that had genuinely believed it was building something new, were becoming something else. Something that the vision had never encompassed and could not accommodate. Li Shucheng, the loyal king, understood with the clarity of a brilliant military mind operating in conditions of absolute crisis that Nanjing could not be held. He had understood this for months. He had pleaded with Hong Shuquan, in the period before the Heavenly King's death in June, to abandon the city, to break out, while there was still a force capable of breaking out, to take the movement into the countryside where it had begun, and where the guerrilla warfare that had sustained it in its earliest days might yet sustain it again. Hong had refused. The heavenly capital was God's city. God would protect it. God would send relief. Li Shucheng, who had spent years fighting the war that God's city required to be defended, and who understood better than any man alive what the military reality actually was, could not override the theological certainty of a heavenly king who had spent those same years retreating further and further from any contact with the world his armies were fighting in. And then Hong Xiuquan died. On June 1st, 1864, the man who had built all of this, who had carried a religious vision from the mountains of Guangxi across 1,000 miles and 14 years and tens of millions of deaths, was gone. The accounts of his final weeks suggest a man who had departed from reality so completely that what remained was something closer to pure theological abstraction than human consciousness. He had continued to issue proclamations. He had continued to receive the divine communications that he had been receiving since his fever visions of 1837. He had told his starving people that God would provide. And then he had died, and God had not provided, and the city was still surrounded, and the boy who inherited the throne of the heavenly kingdom was 16 years old and had never commanded anything in his life. Li Shucheng did what he could. He organized the defense with the resources available to him, which were a fraction of what the task required. He positioned his remaining fighters along the walls. He planned a breakout, not an attempt to hold the city, which was beyond possibility, but an attempt to get the young heavenly king and as many fighters as possible out through the Qing lines before the walls fell, preserving some remnant of the movement that might reconstitute itself elsewhere. It was the strategy of a man who had accepted the loss of this battle and was thinking about whether there could be another. The Qing mines went in beneath the walls through the summer. The tunnelling was extensive. Zheng Guofan's engineers had learned from the same technique the Taiping had used to take the city 11 years before, and were applying it now with the thoroughness that characterized everything about the Shang Army's approach to this final campaign. On July 19th, 1864, the charges were detonated. A section of Nanjing's massive walls that had stood since the early Ming dynasty and that had survived the Taiping assault of 1853, only to be taken by the same method from the other direction, blew outward in a catastrophe of stone and dust and fire. And through the breach, the Xiang army came. What followed inside the walls of Nanjing was one of the most savage episodes of urban combat in a war that had been defined by savagery. The Taiping fighters who remained, gaunt, hungry, many of them sick, reduced to a fraction of the force that had once held the Yangtze Valley, fought with a ferocity that their physical condition should have made impossible. They fought street by street, building by building, with the particular desperate courage of people who had nowhere to retreat to and nothing left to lose. The Qing forces, driven by years of accumulated fury at what the Taiping had done to the provinces through which they had marched, and by the Confucian cultural rage that Zheng Guofan had channeled so effectively into military motivation, gave no quarter. The Taiping had rarely given quarter to Manchu soldiers. Now the accounting was being settled. Li Shucheng managed to get the young heavenly king out of the city before the walls fell, breaking through the Qing lines in the confusion of the final assault with a small escort of fighters. The breakout succeeded in getting the boy to temporary safety in the countryside beyond Nanjing. But Li Shucheng himself, in the chaos of the escape, was separated from the main group. He found a horse and rode, but the horse gave out, and Li Shucheng, the greatest military commander the Taiping had produced, the man who had kept the heavenly kingdom alive for years past the point where it should have collapsed, was captured by Qing forces in the hills south of Nanjing on July 22, 3 days after the walls fell. His capture was treated by Zheng Guofan as an event of the highest importance. Li Shucheng was brought before Zheng personally, and what followed was one of the stranger episodes in the aftermath of the rebellion. Li Shucheng, in captivity and understanding that he was going to die, wrote an extraordinarily long confession, or rather a document that has been called a confession, but reads more like a final accounting. A man with a brilliant analytical mind, sitting down to examine what had happened and why, with the specific clarity that comes when there is nothing left to protect. He wrote about Hong Xiuquan's failures of leadership. He wrote about the Tianjin incident and the catastrophic consequences of the massacre of 1856. He wrote about the theological structure of the heavenly kingdom and the ways in which it had made effective governance impossible. He wrote about the military campaigns with a tactical precision that reveals, even in defeat, the quality of mind that had made him so formidable in the field. He wrote, in short, a document of remarkable historical value. Zheng Guofan read it. He edited it, removing or altering passages that Zheng apparently considered too revealing or too sympathetic to the Taiping cause. The edited version was what reached the Qing court, and what entered the official record. Historians have spent considerable energy trying to reconstruct what the original might have said. Then Zheng had Li Shucheng executed by the slow method of death by 1,000 cuts, Lingxi, reserved for the most serious offenders against the imperial order. A man who had spent his life fighting for the dignity of the poor and the dispossessed, died in the most undignified way that the dynasty he had tried to overthrow could devise. He was somewhere in his late 30s. He had been fighting this war for most of his adult life. The young heavenly king, Hong Tianguifu, did not last much longer. He was captured in Jiangxi province in October of 1864, 3 months after the fall of Nanjing. He had been on the run through the countryside with a dwindling band of followers, a 16-year-old boy trying to carry a theological mandate that had been built by a man of powerful personal charisma and strange inner conviction, carrying it now as pure inheritance, without the foundation of experience or belief or genuine authority that might have given it weight. He was executed in November of 1864 in Nanjing. The last heavenly king died in the city that the first heavenly king had captured 11 years before, and had called God's capital on earth. The scattered remnants of the Taiping armies continued to fight for several more years in various corners of southern and southwestern China. The movements led by the remaining Taiping commanders, who had survived the fall of Nanjing and refused to surrender, were suppressed piecemeal through 1864, 1865, and into 1866, in campaigns that were brutal but increasingly one-sided. The Taiping Rebellion, a separate uprising that had loosely allied itself with the Taiping cause in northern China, was not fully suppressed until 1868. Other Muslim rebellions in the southwest and northwest that had erupted partly in the context of the chaos created by the Taiping Rebellion continued into the 1870s. The Taiping Rebellion as a distinct movement was effectively over with the fall of Nanjing, but the instability it had unleashed echoed through the following decade in ways that continued to cost lives and consume resources that the already devastated empire could not afford. The death toll is the number that stops every conversation about this war, that arrests the mind and refuses to let it move on without first sitting with what it means. The estimates range, depending on the methodology and the sources, from 20 million at the conservative end to 30 million in the middle range to figures as high as 50, or even 70 million at the extreme. The most widely cited scholarly consensus lands somewhere around 20 to 30 million dead. 20 to 30 million human beings. Killed in battle, killed in massacres, killed in the engineered famines that siege warfare produced, killed by the diseases that followed armies and famine with the faithful regularity of shadows, killed by the simple collapse of the agricultural and economic systems that had sustained life in the Yangtze Valley and that the war had methodically destroyed. The provinces most directly affected, Anhui, Jiangxi, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, the areas around Nanjing, and the Yangtze Delta, lost population so catastrophically that the demographic maps of China were permanently redrawn. Cities that had been among the most prosperous and densely settled in the world were depopulated to a degree that took decades to reverse. Nanjing itself, the heavenly capital, which had been a city of perhaps 1 million people before the war, was estimated after the Qing reconquest to have a population that had fallen by 90%. The scale of what had happened to human life in those 14 years in the middle of China is not really a number. It is a concept that the human mind can approach but not fully inhabit. For comparison, and the comparison is not made to diminish either tragedy, but to give the scale of this one its proper weight. The First World War, which shattered the consciousness of an entire civilization and reshaped the political map of the planet and left a psychological wound in the Western world that arguably still is not fully healed, killed somewhere between 15 and 19 million people across 4 years of industrial slaughter across an entire continent. The Taiping Rebellion killed more people in a smaller geographic area over a longer period, and with weapons that were, for most of the conflict, far more primitive than the machine guns and artillery of 1914. The sheer human labour of killing that many people with swords and spears and black powder muskets and engineered starvation is almost impossible to comprehend, and the Western world, which was paying close enough attention to send military officers to help suppress it, which had journalists and diplomats in Shanghai watching the whole thing unfold, which had the intellectual infrastructure to recognise and record what was happening, largely looked away. The Taiping Rebellion did not enter the Western historical consciousness the way that the Napoleonic Wars or the American Civil War or the Crimean War did, despite being larger than all of them. It was filed away in the category of things that happened to other people, in other places, in ways that were too strange and too vast and too culturally distant to be easily accommodated in the narratives that Western civilization was constructing about itself and its era. The missionaries who had provided the pamphlet that started everything were embarrassed by what their pamphlet had started. The merchants wanted to forget the disruption to trade. The diplomats moved on to the next calculation. And the Taiping Rebellion settled into the obscurity that most of the world's largest catastrophes inhabit, present in the specialist literature, invisible in the general consciousness. In China itself, the memory of the Taiping was more complicated and more contested. The Qing dynasty, which had survived the rebellion but had been permanently changed by it, preferred a narrative of heroic suppression, the loyal officials who had saved the dynasty from heretical chaos, the generals who had defeated the demon worshippers and restored Confucian order. Zheng Guofan was elevated to near mythical status as the saviour of civilization. The Taiping themselves were cast as the barbarians at the gate, the forces of chaos and heresy that the forces of order had righteously defeated. This narrative served the dynasty's need for legitimacy. It did not serve the truth, which was that the dynasty the Taiping had nearly destroyed was itself so damaged by the effort of surviving that it would limp forward for less than 50 more years before finally collapsing in the revolution of 1911. Because the Taiping Rebellion did not end with the fall of Nanjing in any deep sense. It ended the movement, killed its leaders, suppressed its armies, but it accelerated processes within Chinese society and within the Qing dynasty that made the dynasty's long-term survival impossible. The financial cost of the suppression had been enormous. The Qing had been forced to allow provincial commanders like Zheng Guofan to raise their own armies, collect their own taxes, govern their own territories in ways that the central government could not control. In saving the dynasty from the Taiping, the Qing court had been forced to decentralize power to the point where the dynasty's ability to actually govern China was permanently compromised. The provincial governors and military commanders who had defeated the Taiping emerged from the war as the real power centers in Chinese society. The emperor in Beijing retained his ceremonial authority, but the practical levers of governance had shifted in ways that could not be reversed. The scholar gentry class that had rallied to suppress the Taiping in defense of Confucian civilization won the battle and in some sense lost the war. Because what the Taiping Rebellion had demonstrated, beyond any possibility of denial, was that the Confucian order could not deliver the social outcomes that the population required. The system that had produced Hong Xiuquan's failures and the grinding poverty of southern China and the corrupt local government that had made tens of millions of people willing to follow a man who claimed to be the son of God. That system was still in place after the rebellion. The Taiping had not reformed it. The Qing had not reformed it. It sat there, creaking and straining under the weight of a growing population and an encroaching modernity it was not equipped to handle, until it finally broke apart in the early 20th century. The Chinese revolutionaries who brought down the Qing dynasty in 1911 understood the connection. Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, came from Guangdong province, the same province that had produced Hong Xiuquan. He grew up hearing stories of the Taiping from people who had lived through the rebellion. He explicitly identified Hong Xiuquan as a predecessor, a man who had tried and failed to do what Sun's own movement would attempt again, to overthrow the Manchu dynasty and establish a new Chinese state built on different principles. The Taiping were rehabilitated in the revolutionary nationalist narrative as proto-patriots, men and women who had fought against the foreign Manchu oppressors and the corrupt old order, failing not because their cause was wrong, but because their methods were insufficiently modern and their leadership insufficiently organized. Mao Zedong took this rehabilitation further. The Taiping Rebellion was incorporated into the Chinese communist historical narrative as an early example of peasant revolution, the uprising of the dispossessed against the ruling class, the proto-socialist elements of the sacred treasury system and the land redistribution program held up as anticipations of the communist program that Mao's revolution would finally achieve. Hong Xiuquan was cast as a revolutionary hero whose failure paved the way for eventual success. The land policies of the Heavenly Kingdom, however imperfectly realized, were presented as evidence that the Chinese peasantry had always understood that the land should belong to those who worked it. The Taiping were made to serve the Communist Party's need for historical predecessors, just as they had served the Nationalist Party's need for nationalist heroes. Neither reading was entirely wrong. Neither was entirely right. The Taiping Rebellion was too large and too contradictory and too human to be reduced to a clean ideological lesson. It was a peasant uprising and a religious movement and a military campaign and a social experiment and a catastrophe and a genuine attempt to build something better, all at the same time. And the attempt to pull any single thread from that tangle and call it the essential truth of what happened is always going to distort more than it reveals. What it was, at its most fundamental, was the consequence of a system that had stopped working for the people it was supposed to serve. The Qing dynasty in the early 19th century was not evil in any simple sense. It was old. It was rigid. It had been built for a world that no longer existed and had not found a way to adapt to the world that did exist. And in the gap between what it promised and what it delivered, in that gap where the examination system closed its doors on brilliant young men from farming families, where corrupt officials took the last coins from starving villagers, where the opium trade ate the social fabric from the inside, where foreign gunboats dismantled the carefully maintained fiction of Chinese invulnerability. In that gap, a man had a fever dream and came back from it convinced that God had spoken to him. And that conviction, finding a landscape that was ready for it, had produced the deadliest civil war in human history. The landscape of the Yangtze Valley in the years after 1864 was something that travellers described with a consistent quality of stunned disbelief. Cities that had been among the most beautiful and prosperous in the world stood empty or burned. Rice paddies that had fed millions had reverted to scrubland. The population that had created and sustained one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth was reduced, in the worst affected areas, to a ghost of itself, scattered, traumatized, beginning the slow and painful work of rebuilding lives in places where almost everything that had given those lives structure and meaning had been destroyed. It would take decades. Some areas never fully recovered. The demographic wound left by the rebellion was visible in population statistics into the 20th century, and in the ruins of the Heavenly Palace in Nanjing, where Hong Xiuquan had retreated from the world and issued his divine proclamations, and lost contact with the reality of the kingdom his vision had built. In those ruins, which the Xiang army had comprehensively burned and looted in the aftermath of the city's fall, there was nothing left of the heavenly kingdom but ash, and the memory of what had been attempted there, the sacred treasury that was supposed to abolish poverty, the female battalions that were supposed to give women a place in the divine order, the land redistribution that was supposed to make the earth reflect heaven's equality, the ban on opium that was supposed to heal the wound that the foreign trade had opened in the body of Chinese society. All of it, the vision and the reality, the ideal and the terrible gap between the ideal and what human beings actually managed to do with it, reduced to ash in the summer heat of 1864. But ash is not nothing. Ash is what remains after burning. And what burned in Nanjing in 1864 was not just a city and a movement and a vision that had failed. What burned was also the proof that the failure had happened, the evidence that tens of millions of people had looked at the world they were living in and found it so completely unacceptable that they had been willing to follow a man who claimed to be the Son of God to the ends of the earth, or at least to the walls of the Yangtze Valley, in search of something better. That refusal, that absolute, burning, costly refusal to accept the verdict that the existing order had passed on their lives, did not die with the heavenly kingdom. It went underground, it waited, it surfaced again in 1911, and again in 1949, and again in ways that the history of modern China has continued to record. The Taiping are gone. The impulse that produced them is not a historical phenomenon. It is a permanent feature of what happens when systems stop serving the people they exist to serve, and those people finally find a voice loud enough to say so. Hong Xiuquan found his voice in a fever dream and a missionary pamphlet. His kingdom lasted 14 years and killed 30 million people and changed China forever, and is almost completely unknown in the world outside China. The war that he started was the bloodiest conflict of the 19th century. The idea at the centre of it, that the existing order was not divinely ordained but humanly constructed, and could therefore be humanly dismantled and rebuilt, was the most dangerous idea in the world. It still is. That is where we leave them tonight. In the ash and the silence and the slow beginning of the world that came after. 30 million voices that the history books in most of the world have never learnt to hear. A kingdom of heaven that lasted just long enough to prove that the impulse to build one never goes away, no matter how many times it fails, no matter how much it costs, no matter how completely the walls come down in the end. The Yangtze keeps moving. It moved through the heavenly kingdom, and it moved through its ruins, and it is moving still, carrying the silt of everything that has happened on its banks down toward the sea, the way rivers always do, indifferent to dynasties, indifferent to heavenly mandates, indifferent to the dreams of men who look at the broken world and decide that God has given them the task of fixing it. And now, before you drift off completely, are you still awake? If this story found its way to you tonight, if you made it all the way from the rice paddies of Guangxi to the burning walls of Nanjing, then you already know that the world is full of histories this vast and this forgotten, waiting to be told in the quiet hours when everything else goes still. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, it would mean a great deal if you took a moment to like this video and subscribe. It is a small thing that makes an enormous difference in keeping these stories alive and finding their way to people who need them. And if you are still here, still listening, drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you are right now, what time it is, whether you made it to the end, or whether the Taiping Rebellion carried you gently off to sleep somewhere along the Yangtze. Either way, that is exactly what this was made for. For now, let your breathing slow. Let the history settle around you like something heavy and warm. Let the Yangtze River carry you the rest of the way. Good night, sleep well, and thank you for being here.